not really economic, right, doing offshore.
I just had a meeting on that very issue with some people yesterday.
Well, no one's working.
Reflecting on this multi-purpose.
Right. How that can look.
Because you're right, it doesn't last forever.
Right. So it's an interesting conversation.
Oh, nice.
From our side, we're-
Yeah, that was a long one.
Definitely was on. I didn't expect it to go that long.
No.
Gonna be stacked.
Hello? Pleasure. No, nice to meet you.
Pretty much just made this your personal hearing space.
Apparently. I think we were delegated that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nobody else.
It helps when we can, just work one of the huge subcommittees that can actually fit all
I'm about to say, you all have one of the smallest subcommittees too, so that would explain. Aviation, highways.
My value, my value.
members who are not on the sub. I'm the only one that likes this room.
The Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that Chairman be authorized to declare a recess any time during the committee hearing without objection. Show that ordered. Also ask unanimous consent that members who are not on the committee could be allowed to participate in asking questions and other items without objection. Show that ordered. As a reminder, well, I'm not going to remind you that. Just if you have an amendment, make sure it gets emailed to the Transportation Committee. I recognize myself for the purpose of an opening statement for 5 minutes. Today we'll receive testimony from stakeholders regarding the maritime supply chain, including their views on the implementation of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, the Maritime Administration's management of the Port Infrastructure Development Program. I'd like to welcome our witnesses, Bud Dar, Executive Vice President of MSC Group, Matthew Leach, President and CEO of Ports America, Buddy Allen, President and CEO of American Cotton Shippers Association, and Mario Cordero, Executive Director of Port Long Beach, California. Small port out there, right? These witnesses represent crucial aspects of the supply chain, including shippers, ports, marine terminal operators, ocean carriers, and we look forward to having them sharing their valuable insight. During the COVID-19 pandemic, a sudden and massive increase in consumer demand, combined with labor shortages, manufacturing disruptions, and other factors fueled a supply chain crisis that continues to strain the capacity of our maritime transportation system. This led to significant increases in ocean shipping costs, delayed shipments, and extended cargo wait times at ports, as well as an imbalance of maritime trade flows, leading to frequent export of empty containers from the United States rather than moving those containers inland to be filled with domestically produced goods, particularly agricultural products. Consumers were left with higher prices. American companies seeking to export their goods faced hurdles in getting their products to the ports. In response, Congress passed the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022. Among its provisions, the law set standards that detention and demurrage charges must comply with, set penalties for charges deemed inaccurate, allows the Federal Maritime Commission to set the minimum contract standards for ocean shipping services contracts to protect U.S. shippers from actions that leave export cargoes stranded in the United States ports, and increase protections for United States shippers from retaliation by foreign ocean carriers. Last week, this subcommittee heard from the Federal Maritime Commission on their efforts to implement the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. We look forward to hearing your views as well. To provide support for our maritime supply chain, Congress authorized significant funding for the Port Infrastructure Development Program, known as PIDP, which is operated by the Maritime Administration and provides grants in coastal ports, inland river ports, and Great Lakes ports infrastructure to improve the safety, efficiency, and reliability of the movement of goods. Last week, we've heard from the Maritime Administration regarding the President's budget request for this program, which in addition to the $450 million in advanced appropriations the program received through the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, though this program is intended to help Oregon optimize and improve port operations, I am concerned that the program's ability to fully realize this goal is limited by language Congress routinely includes in the program's authorization that prohibits the use of funds for automated cargo handling equipment. I look forward to hearing your views on how port operations can optimize and the role automation can play in improving port operations and our nation's supply chains. Thank you for participating today. Look forward to your testimony. I now recognize the Ranking Member Carvajal for an opening statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As in the past, I will yield the floor to Ranking Member Larson, if that's with your consent.
Ranking Member Larson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member. If the last 3 years has taught us anything, it's that a robust and resilient supply chain is essential to our economic and national security. Now, last week, this subcommittee heard from the Federal Maritime Commission and the Maritime Administration on the fiscal year 2024 budget request and the implementation of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. Today, we'll hear from industry representatives on how they think implementation of these laws is going and what more we can do to prevent disruption to our supply chain in the future. There was no better demonstration of the supply chain backlog during the COVID-19 pandemic than at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, although I think the Port of Everett came in a close second, where nearly 100 vessels were forced to idle offshore. However, the problem was nationwide, and the Puget Sound saw more vessels seeking anchorage than ever before. As imported goods were in high demand, carriers rushed to return containers, often empty, to Asia so they could be loaded again. Meanwhile, U.S. companies struggled to obtain cargo space at a reasonable price and in a timely manner, which meant their exports, often perishable, languished landside. The icing on the cake was when they were given a bill for unfair and unreasonable detention and demurrage fees as a result of a situation over which they had no control. Thankfully, a bipartisan Congress and President Biden moved quickly to address the supply chain crisis, passing historic legislation like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022. Included in the BIL was $6.5 billion exclusively for ports and $27 billion that ports would be eligible for. The creation of the Supply Chain Disruptions Task Force and the Freight Logistics Optimization Works Initiative, or the FLOW Initiative, optimized funding for ports to improve supply chain fluidity and increase coordination among every link of the supply chain. Since the passage of OSRA, the FMC has moved quickly to establish a process for accepting, investigating, and adjudicating charge complaints, update regulations on penalties, and issue a final rule on detention and demurrage. The pandemic made clear the need for investments in maritime infrastructure. Maritime commerce is a significant contributor as well to global carbon emissions, and both the BIL and the Inflation Reduction Act demonstrate that targeted investments can improve resiliency in the maritime supply chain and reduce emissions. Investing in low or no emission technology at ports does not mean sacrificing efficiency. Projects like the Middle Harbor Terminal Zero Emission Conversion Project at the Port of Long Beach demonstrate that fact clearly. That project will lower emissions, create a more resilient port, and make the movement of cargo more efficient. This project funds the replacement of aging diesel tractors with electric tractors, construction of electric charging infrastructure, and installation of software equipment to streamline cargo handling operations. And Mr. Cordero, I look forward to hearing about this and other projects underway at the port. And despite the congestion we saw at the ports in 2021 and 22, one thing never slowed: the hardworking and dedicated longshore workers. They put in long hours each day to keep containers flowing, despite the constant threat of exposure to COVID-19 and a massive backlog of cargo waiting to be shipped. Our human infrastructure is critical to the U.S. economy, and I want to be clear that I think federal dollars should not be used to put longshore workers out of a job. The Port Infrastructure Development Program prohibits federal dollars from being used to eliminate jobs, and I'll work to ensure that prohibition remains. If we want to prevent the next supply chain crisis, we have to invest in ports. They serve as the gateway for international trade And without modern infrastructure, our businesses, consumers, and communities are at risk. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on what they're doing and how the federal government and what the federal government can do to work with them to prevent another supply chain crisis. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Carbajal, you're now recognized for your remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Webster, for scheduling this important maritime transportation supply chain issues hearing. While we touched on aspects of the supply chain and the bipartisan Ocean Shipping Reform Act in the previous hearing, I look forward to a deeper discussion on this important topic. The maritime industry is a critical pillar of our economy. In 2020, ocean-going trade accounted for 40% of U.S. international value, amounting to 18% of our country's GDP. In 2020, the top 25 tonnage ports alone handled over 1.7 billion tons of cargo, including vital goods like food, medical supplies, and everyday households. It is an understatement to say that our economy would not function without a reliable and fair maritime industry. In fact, the COVID pandemic highlighted the importance of our supply chain and the devastating impacts that can occur if we do not invest in our maritime industry and the agencies that regulate them, like the FMC, Federal Maritime Commission, and the United States Coast Guard. During the height of COVID, I heard from exporters across dozens of industries about unfair shipping practices, exorbitant costs, which put companies out of business and resulted in higher prices for their customers. To be clear, the astronomical profits realized by foreign shipping companies contributed to inflation in the United States. Some supply chain gridlock and unfair shipping practices caused the value of California food exports to fall by $2.1 billion, or about 17%. That's just in California. I was proud to work across the aisle to pass the OSRA last Congress. Since its passage, we have already seen a decrease in federal congestion at the ports and significant refunds in undue charges by carriers. As we heard last week, the FMC moved quickly on rulemaking and self-executing policies excluded in the law. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about how our supply chain has become more resilient, fair, and transparent as a result of the passage of this bill. I'm also eager to hear about the investments in our ports and port infrastructure will continue to support robust international trade and American jobs. As a nexus where cargo moves in and out of our economy, ports have an important role to play in our supply chain. There is no doubt that our supply chain remains susceptible to major market fluctuations and international events. With the passage of OSRA, and the bipartisan infrastructure law, though we have already made significant progress in building a more resilient supply chain. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'm eager to dive into a conversation about how Congress can further support a strong maritime industry and resilient supply chain. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thanks so much. First of all, let me introduce the mayor of Petersburg, Alaska, who happens to be here. Good to have, yeah, good to have you. Now, I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for being here today. Briefly, I'd like to take a moment to explain our lighting system. There's red as you're out of time, but yellow means you're leading up to it, and green means you still got time. So just watch that. I also like unanimous consent for the witnesses' full statement to be included in the record without objection. Show that ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the committee asks you to limit your remarks to 5 minutes. And with that, Mr. Dar, you are recognized for the first to give your 5-minute testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you, members, for the opportunity to be here today and speak with you about this important topic. My name is Bud Dar. I'm the Executive Vice President for Maritime Policy and Government Affairs at the MSC Group. MSC stands for Mediterranean Shipping Company. We are the world's largest liner shipping company. I'm also here today on behalf of the World Shipping Council, which represents 90% of the liner shipping industry worldwide. I'm not going to repeat what's in my written statement. You have it. But I would like to just highlight a few points for you to consider. First of all, with regard to what we've just been through, it has been an extraordinary excursion in supply, demand, volumes, rates, and congestion, the likes of which we've not seen in this industry ever, all related to, one way or another, the COVID pandemic. We've made it through that, and now we've seen an environment where as quickly as rates went up, rates came down even faster, volumes came down faster, and we're now at the point where the supply chains are fluid once again, but quite honestly, not for necessarily the best of reasons. Their supply chains opened up because demand fell way off, not necessarily because of things collectively that we have accomplished, although we did a lot to get through it together. And I have to say, commerce kept moving, world trade kept moving, because the liner shipping industry and others in the shipping industry, with the great assistance of our seafarers who endured terrible hardship during the pandemic, managed to keep it all flowing. And I do really want to recognize that as a fact. 3 points I'd like to leave you with briefly. One is the market has reacted as if market dynamics would suggest it should. That we immediately saw when the pandemic began a drop-off in demand, capacity was taken out of the networks, and then when demand came back very quickly in the third quarter of 2020, we saw an enormous rebound in volumes, which together with congestion and overloaded supply chains around the world resulted in a decrease of capacity to meet that demand. And as you might expect, rates went up accordingly. But what comes up must come down. We predicted that would happen. It has happened. Now that volumes have dropped off, the cliff on the way down has been very steep as well. And we're now at the point of essentially similar market dynamics of both volumes and rates to what we saw pre-pandemic. I will add, as an illustration of that we could have had 7,000 ships in our network instead of 700. And it still would have made a difference. Those 7,000 ships would have been piled up outside the ports rather than the numbers that we did have. So fundamentally what we had here, and this is my second point about the supply chains themselves and what it takes to make them more resilient and more capable to meet the needs of commerce of the United States market in the future, is let's not persuade ourselves that it's a job done with that regard, because it's not. And the fundamentals about both infrastructure and the way that we operate the supply chains on the inland side of the supply chain needed work before the pandemic, became painfully illustrated during the pandemic, and continue to need work today so that we'll be better prepared for whatever the next catalyst is for disruptions in the supply chain. And hopefully we'll be better prepared at that point to deal with it. But we need to do those things and do them in a serious way up and down the supply chain. You didn't see a meltdown of ocean shipping. We didn't suddenly forget how to operate ships. We did that very well. What you saw was a meltdown of the shoreside elements, causing congestion in the terminals, congestions in the ports, and the symptoms of seeing ships anchored, numbers larger than 100, for example, in San Pedro Bay, which I hope in my lifetime we never see again. The last point that I'll leave you with for your consideration is about caution in government intervention in the market at this moment. OSRA 22 was just enacted not too many months ago. The FMC, I don't believe, has actually completed yet the first of numerous rulemakings they have to do. And I think that we would all benefit from seeing where that lands and how it goes. But this was a market system that functioned quite well and delivered extraordinarily low-cost shipping services worldwide pre-pandemic. And I think it can do so again. But we do need to be somewhat cautious to make sure that well-intentioned efforts do not have the opposite effect of perhaps what's intended. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Now, Mr. Leach, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Carbajal, and members of the subcommittee, my name is Matthew Leach, and I serve as President and CEO of Ports America. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you this afternoon. Ports America is the largest marine terminal operator, or commonly known as MTO, and stevedore in the United States. As an American company, we've been operating for over 100 years, and we are one of the largest U.S. maritime employers. Currently, Ports America manages operations in 33 ports in 70 locations throughout the country. The highest priority in our operations is the health and safety of our indispensable workers. I'm also here today on behalf of the National Association of Waterfront Employers, NAWI, of which Ports America is a proud member. NAWI is a nonprofit trade association who ensures that there are open lines of communication between Congress, regulatory agencies, and the gateways to our nation's international commerce through proactive advocacy. MTOs are the linchpin of our maritime transportation industry, employing thousands of American waterfront workers, investing in U.S. port infrastructure, and serving as the critical link moving cargo between sea and land. We all understand and witness the significant supply chain disruptions experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the current maritime supply chain is vastly different. Maritime cargo volumes and freight rates have normalized to pre-COVID-19 levels, and in many cases, they are lower. In 2022, Congress responded to this crisis, including leaders within this subcommittee, and enacted the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, commonly referred to as OSRA. OSRA directed the Federal Maritime Commission to undertake several administrative and regulatory actions to implement the Commission's new authorities. I applaud the efforts of the commissioners and their staff in taking rapid action through repeated public engagement. In some cases, the Commission has gotten it right, such as increasing investigation of improper charges and practices and diligently implementing the new charge complaint process. In other cases, however, the Commission doesn't appear to be getting it right. Notably, in the issuance of its October 2022 Notice of Proposed Rulemaking regarding demurrage and detention billing requirements, I offer two specific examples. First, the proposed rule as drafted would penalize MTOs, threaten an MTO's ability to charge terminal demurrage, which we consider a storage fee. Second, in a recent informal adjudication decision taken up by the FMC, a majority of the commissioners determined that the imposition of equipment detention, essentially a fee charged by ocean carriers for the use of their equipment beyond free time on holiday weekend when the equipment return location was normally closed, was at odds with the incentive principle and therefore unreasonable under the Shipping Act. The application of the interpretation of this recent decision falls short of the Commission's own incentive principle as noted in Commissioner Bensel's sole dissenting opinion. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the hearing record Commissioner Bensel's dissenting order, TCW Inc. versus Evergreen Shipping Agency America Corp. And Evergreen Line.
So ordered.
Thank you. Despite this clear notice and the fact that the shipper's agent had every opportunity to return the equipment before the holiday weekend, the Commission deemed the detention charges unreasonable. Some in the industry believe that this logic could be extended to terminal demurrage or storage, even though the terminal demurrage or storage is qualitatively different from equipment detention. The analysis under the incentive rule should consider both the actual differences in the charges as well as the costs associated for the services the fees are compensating. In this industry, fees for storage of goods are and always have been a time-based service, irrespective of the day of the week. In the interest of time, my written testimony includes relevant information regarding investments MTOs have made on operations and cargo handling equipment. Our industry appreciates congressional support to modernize port infrastructure and achieve decarbonization of the entire maritime sector, including our local communities. I want to thank you all for inviting me to share these updates and these concerns on critical issues which impact our industry.
Thank you very much. Mr. Allen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Carbajal, Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Carbajal, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding this hearing. I'm honored to have the opportunity to contribute my testimony in the perspective of the American Cotton Shippers Association, or ACSA. ACSA is a trade association primarily made up of cotton merchants founded in 1924. Our members handle the vast majority of U.S. cotton and foreign growths of cotton traded around the world. Our services consist of merchandising, delivery logistics, and risk management. Simply put, we buy cotton from farmers, sell and deliver it to yarn spinners in the U.S. and around the world. We harmonize our customers' very different needs while managing many of their risks, including price, time, transportation, currency, geopolitics, and quality. With approximately 85% of U.S. cotton exported in a containerized and non-fungible manner, a functional and reliable intermodal supply chain that provides adequate service to exporters is mandatory to support overall risk management and U.S. competitiveness in the global marketplace. During the supply chain crisis that stemmed from the COVID-19 pandemic, our members experienced unprecedented challenges and risk. Cotton is produced and concentrated in our country's interior and moved intermodally to domestic mills or ports of export around the world. Efficient performance requires harmony, sequencing and executing appointments with warehousemen, equipment providers, draymen, rail providers, ocean shippers, and terminal operators. Challenges at each point within our industry's procedures created collective dysfunction. Our industry has enjoyed a long and fruitful relationship with ocean carriers. We are not here today to assign blame to any single party for these events. We must work together to develop practical solutions moving forward. We believe that meaningful structural changes must be made to prevent similar dysfunction from recurring. Our view is that current relief in our supply chain is solely based on global economic downturn that curtailed consumption of goods and related volumes of inbound cargo. Inundation has been replaced with elasticity in our supply chain. This reprieve is temporary. Our economy will strengthen, cargo volumes will increase, and we must capitalize on this opportunity to prepare for renewed cargo saturation within our supply chain. ACSA applauds Congress and the Federal Maritime Commission, or FMC, for the passage and aggressive implementation of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, referred to as OSRA. Key elements of ACSA policy positions are addressed in OSRA, including the categorical denial of service to exporters, reasonableness when levying fees, and choice in the procurement of chassis. The results of OSRA's implementation, related rulemaking, and administrative processes are pending and appear to be, in our opinion, of varying value. We believe that OSRA will likely fall short of providing the needed assurance exporters seek concerning the availability of service when economic conditions favor empty sailings or imports. Concerning detention and demurrage, we find value in the documentation regime created by FMC, although we request further establishment of causation in these submissions. ACSA is supportive of FMC's recent decision that denial of choice and chassis procurement for merchant haulage is unreasonable and in violation of the Shipping Act, a decision that has been broadly advocated for by an extensive coalition of importers, exporters, and their service providers. We also want to flag the importance of OSRA's prescribed study on best practices for chassis. This should be done in a comprehensive manner. ACSA was a proponent of creating the National Shipper Advisory Committee and is supportive of their recommendations to the FMC. Specifically, we endorse measures to bring clarity to jurisdictional questions and expanded oversight to FMC throughout the entirety of maritime bills of lading, the establishment of uniform and reasonable terms concerning cargo receiving, and active steps to enhance data visibility and integrity. In addition to the reform and commercial practices outlined in my testimony, I'd like to acknowledge ACSA's commitment to the development of a modernized culture in containerized shipping, one that embraces digitalization and the utility of a blockchain ledger to streamline data management and expand opportunities for global cotton merchandising. In conclusion, I would be remiss not to acknowledge how valuable our experience working with the FMC has been in recent years. Given their size and given their resources, they have been asked to punch above their weight class throughout this process. I'm pleased to report that they are doing so while maintaining active engagement with stakeholders and seeking equitable outcomes that will promote a sound supply chain. We hope this will be taken into consideration as FMC appeals for critical resources to manage their expanding scope. Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Okay, former Chairman Cordero, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good? Okay, here we go. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Carvajal, thank you for inviting me to testify before the subcommittee today regarding the state of the maritime transportation supply chain issues. My name is Mario Cordero. I am the Executive Director of the Port of Long Beach. The Port of Long Beach is a premier U.S. gateway for trans-Pacific trade, and nearly 40% of the container cargo entering the United States comes through the Port of Long Beach and our neighbor, Port of Los Angeles. The port welcomes the largest vessels in operation and is the nation's leading export port with more than 1.4 million TEUs of loaded exports that have been moved. The port is building the most modern and sustainable marine facilities in the world, and we are committed to a zero-emission future. We all remember not so long ago when ships were waiting in the San Pedro Bay complex for days before they were able to unload their vessels. While trade was slowed, most of us learned the past. We need to take in consideration the past and not make the mistakes of the past, and take action to ensure that we do not have supply chain interruptions in the future. Recognizing the need for technology solutions that would enable terminal operators, ocean carriers, and shippers to efficiently coordinate the movement of goods, the port developed the Supply Chain Information Highway, a digital solution that provides shippers and the supply chain with data that can be integrated into their own systems. Congress' passage of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act will be a catalyst to ensure goods move efficiently through our ports. As a former chairman of the FMC, I am well aware of the balance that the FMC must strike by enabling competition among ocean carriers and terminal operators while protecting shippers and consumers from unfair practices. OSRA will give the FMC additional authority to promote the growth of U.S. exports through an ocean transportation system that is competitive, economic, and efficient. The Port of Long Beach is in the midst of a $2.6 billion program for capital improvements for the next decade. New grant programs create opportunities to secure funds for projects that will put more containers on rail, reduce truck traffic, and reduce carbon emissions. The port has benefited greatly from the Port Infrastructure Development Program. Most recently, the port secured FY 2022 funding for $30.1 million to deploy the nation's largest fleet of manually operated zero-emission cargo handling equipment at the Long Beach Container Terminal. PIDP funds, however, do fall short of what is necessary. The PIDP is oversubscribed at the rate of 4-to-1, and I call on Congress to fully fund the PIDP at its $750 million authorization level. Permitting delays are also making the program more difficult, such as marriage unnecessary barriers that prevent it from using the categorical exclusions of other USDOT model agencies. Congress should require USDOT to update its regulations to allow model agencies to use the same categorical exclusions. We also have concerns about the level of data that's requested by the port performance reporting requirements. We are interested in exploring how we can coordinate data sharing efforts in place through USDOT's Flow Initiative and our Supply Chain Information Highway. The Port of Long Beach is investing in a state-of-the-art rail facility, the Pier B on-dock support facility, which will enhance on-dock rail capacity and expedite cargo movement. We are building a $1.5 billion project in phases and are pursuing competitive grants for federal funds from the USDOT. I have 6 recommendations as follows. 1, encourage investment in technology so that the shippers, ocean carriers, container terminal operators, and truck companies are able to efficiently plan and schedule their operations to prevent bottlenecks, in essence, maximizing digital transformation. 2, encourage the supply chain to operate within a 24/7 framework when needed to reduce bottlenecks and promote efficiency. 3, direct federal funding to projects that will facilitate goods movement and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, such as the MEGA program. 4, I ask Congress to fully fund the PIDP at $750 million in authorization level. It will take more than $2 billion to achieve our goals of zero-emission cargo handling equipment by 2030 and zero-emission drayage trucks by 2035. 5, likewise, funds in the IIJA and IRA directed to reducing emissions at ports are invaluable, will spur investments to expedite port electrification. And last, continue to support the required resources to the FMC to ensure a competitive and reliable international ocean transportation supply system. In conclusion, I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee. This is an exciting time in terms of technology and innovation to enable U.S. ports to be true economic drivers. I am happy to offer my views and look forward to any questions the committee may ask. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll go to questions, and I'll ask my questions first. Mr. Dar, you expressed concerns about FMC's proposal, proposed rulemaking that would limit detention and demurrage. The charges for certain entities and potential impact on the potential principle of an incentive principle. What would you like to see as a better alternative to how we find a balance between incentivizing the movement of cargo and ensuring the charges are fair?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I think we're all in agreement here, it sounds like, among the witnesses, that detention and demurrage has an important role to play in ensuring fluidity. So it has some role. The question is, what's the right framework? And the challenge that we raised with regard to the rulemaking is that the proposed rule seems to abandon the incentive principle that the FMC had previously embraced, which basically judges it on a fact-specific case-by-case basis on if a charge actually improves fluidity and resiliency in the supply chain, and instead specifies specific parties that can be charged and those that cannot. And the real fundamental problem with that is it could leave you in a situation where in many cases, a party gets charged that is not in a position to actually improve that fluidity, and other cases where the party that could actually make a difference cannot be charged. So it would seem to miss the mark on the direction that it's headed right now, and certainly that can't be what Congress actually intended from my perspective, because I think the intention was to improve fluidity.
Mr. Leach, you have anything to add to that?
I concur with that, and I think I clarified that pretty well in my oral statement, Mr. Chairman. And one of the distinctions I would like to make very clearly amongst the committee is the demurrage on terminal demurrage, as it's called, is just storage. And when goods are moved through the transport chain, terminal, off terminal, to destination, there is storage along that way for those goods, whether it's in a warehouse, a depot, or a terminal. So there is no distinction in terms of that as a reasonable charge. And one way to facilitate better engagement is for shippers to directly engage with MTOs who have that capacity inside of their asset base and can offer different service levels under different pricing levels. So part of the issue we have as an industry is MTOs are operating underneath a supply chain that's being managed end-to-end, typically by a liner company.
Mr. Allen, do you have anything to add to that?
I would simply say that the amount of erroneous charges and the lack of efficient appeal process begged for reform and improvement. Is this perfect? Arguably not. What is it exactly is still somewhat to be determined, but we believe that significant progress has been made.
The Shipping Act provides for certain trust exemptions for ocean carriers. Can you talk about the role of these antitrust exemptions and how they are used in the industry? what would be the impact of removing them? Anybody want to respond to that? Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly would be happy to comment. First of all, I'd like to put it into perspective. I checked this morning to make sure my recollection was accurate, and of our 700 or so ships in our network, we have 86 that are actually in the 2M Alliance, which is our alliance. So you need to be careful not to overstate what role the alliances play in the overall picture in the market, because it can be kind of distorted if you're not careful with the numbers. The reason that the alliances are very useful, and vessel sharing agreements, which is a broader term which is used sometimes in very small agreements too, is that it provides additional capacity because you can better utilize the available capacity that's out there. You can provide more services to more ports, particularly smaller ports that might not end up getting services at all if a carrier had to rely simply on their own very capital-intensive resources to serve those. And the efficiencies that are gained, not just as far as managing costs, but also efficiency with energy consumption and therefore greenhouse gas emissions, are minimized. That would change. And those additional costs that come from that ultimately would find their way back into the market if the VSAs were not allowable in some form as we understand them today. They serve a very valuable purpose, and particularly with smaller ports and niche shippers.
Thank you very much. My time's expired. Okay. Mr. Carbajal, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Allen, in your testimony, you expressed concern regarding the FMC's refusal to deal rulemaking. What do you believe should be the result of rulemaking? And are there any issues Congress should be considering?
Thank you, Mr. Carbajal. We can all imagine, this is a complex matter to resolve. And enjoyed the exchange this subcommittee had with Chairman Maffei last week, where he testified if you built a bridge in the interior, it would help him. We tend to agree to that. I think all of these witnesses appreciate the complexity. With that said, we think there's some common sense improvements. We do desire some form of assurance or mandate that in all economic conditions, exporters, particularly agricultural exporters like our members, will be afforded access to services that we depend upon, and we're very good customers of our colleagues here at the table today. With that said, we think there's some low-hanging fruit in the cultural practices within the U.S. that don't necessarily cost a lot of money or time or change if we can work together. One is coming up with a reasonable regime for cargo receiving that's consistent. When carriers are sharing space in the alliances that Mr. Dar just described, if we could find harmony in their procedures and requirements as well as the terminal operators, it would bring great visibility and opportunity for us to make our scheduling. When we're weeks out at interior warehouses and days out from change with ocean carriers, it just simply does not synchronize. At the same time, data sharing, visibility, and communication is ripe for improvement. We need every measure to open systems for equipment use and introduce additional assets. And the thing that I would flag for this subcommittee to please consider focusing on is jurisdictional clarity. Jurisdictional clarity across the full entirety of a maritime bill of lading. To what extent is it governed or is the oversight provided by the Federal Maritime Commission, and at what point is it the Surface Transportation Board? And we would ask an expansion of the Federal Maritime Commission's jurisdiction to cover the entirety of that maritime move.
Thank you. Mr. Cordero, you have highlighted the work the Port of Long Beach has done to reduce emissions at the port. By investing in emissions reduction, are you losing out on efficiency, or is the port becoming more efficient at the same time?
Thank you, Ranking Member Cabrahan, for the question. And my answer to that question is there is no question that we are creating more efficiency, in my view. So I think, again, over the many years that the port has moved forward pursuing the Green Port policy that was initially passed back in 2005, I think that we have been environmental stewards and operational stewards in terms of proving to the fact that not only have we increased in terms of our ability and how we move cargo in good times, but also how efficient we do it in a sustainable fashion in reducing emissions. So I think, again, and I will say our partner in doing this is the Port of LA. I think in the San Pedro Bay complex, I think it's a gateway that has proven that the fact that efficiency is in fact furthered with our reducing emission game plan in terms of going towards zero emissions.
Thank you. Mr. Dar, in your testimony, you mentioned MSC's goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. How will investments in ports from the funds in the bipartisan infrastructure law support MSC's goal and benefit industry overall? What is the magnitude of short-sighted investments needed to bring on new alternative fuels?
Thank you, sir. The role of shoreside investments is key, in part minimizing the amount of wasted transit time and moving to a system that's much more of a just-in-time port arrival rather than a hurry-up-and-wait sort of port arrival system could make an enormous difference. We've kind of done that on the West Coast to relieve pressure on the anchorage, but I was literally sitting in Glasgow at the climate conference there when we enacted that as an industry initiative, and it made a huge difference as well in efficiency of how we operate the ships. The fuel itself, that energy transition, will be between $1 and $2 trillion at a minimum to actually help the shipping industry fully transition to net zero by the fuels in 2050. So investments in fuel development, fuel infrastructure, delivery, and making them available, particularly on the largest of the trade lanes, could make a huge difference sooner rather than later. And we would certainly encourage all of those types of investments, as well as those in terminal efficiency.
Thank you. I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to ask my question. If you could submit the answer for the record. Mr. Cordero, I'm greatly concerned by the impact of emissions and poor air quality on the oftentimes disadvantaged communities that live around ports. Can you discuss, not necessarily discuss, but forward some information, some of the environmental justice work the Port of Long Beach has done and how smaller ports can replicate that? If you could submit that for the record, that would be great. Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I yield back.
Mr. Madden, 5 minutes.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. Appreciate it. The U.S. maritime industry keeps our nation's economy running. The ongoing growth seen in southeast Texas is a great example of that. We've got some great ports there, including the #1 port in the nation by tonnage, the Port of Houston, which is in my district. The entire Houston Ship Channel is busy day and night, a conduit for shippers sending and receiving goods to and from all around the world. COVID brought new attention to port operations and ocean shipping, shining a light on the importance of an industry that many folks, in fact, I think most of our country simply doesn't understand. Last Congress, we tried to address both new and long-standing issues with our ocean transportation system when we passed the OSRA, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. However, even as we've heard so much about supply chain issues and the need to improve the status quo, I've heard concerns from industry about the direction that regulators want to move forward with. My colleagues and I are all too familiar with unelected federal employees in Washington taking a completely different direction from the intent of Congress, resulting in new unintended problems rather than the intended solutions. So, Mr. Leach, thanks for your testimony earlier. Given your background and industry knowledge, you should be well qualified to answer these questions. Last week, FMC Chairman Maffei testified that the Commission must avoid actions that would disincentivize the timely retrieval of cargo from marine terminals. Do you believe that if cargo owners are given free weekend and holiday storage at marine terminals, that it would disincentivize cargo owners from removing their cargo in a timely manner, and also would the resulting Monday traffic increase be potentially dangerous?
In response, I've made some commentary already in
Right.
my statement regarding this issue, and clearly we are very clear to the industry in terms of the disincentive principle and the availability of cargo, and giving another free use of the asset to the cargo community ultimately is a disincentive. We want to encourage pickups. We want to encourage fluidity. We can manage those parties who wish to have an engagement, a long-stay engagement. We can segregate and operationally change what we do to manage efficiently and provide a service. but we need to know about it. There needs to be an open channel of communication.
Would the resulting Monday increase in traffic be potentially dangerous too?
That's very difficult to predict.
Okay, all right. Marine container terminals lease waterfront property at most U.S. ports, and that property is typically finite. When containers are not picked up in a timely manner, how does that affect your operations?
Typically, the longer the container stays, the denser the facility becomes, the more non-revenue work we do to manage an operation, which reduces fluidity. So it directly affects capacity and capability.
Congestion will be back sooner or later, and we need to get away from the idea that terminals are waterfront warehouses. How do you suggest that we change this perception?
We in the industry, from a terminal operator perspective, are flexible to be a solutions provider to storage. But it's something we need to plan for in advance, in a dialogue with the cargo owner, and not be caught with unexpected. Again, to manage that capacity, manage fluidity, we can provide solutions with the right sharing of information.
Absolutely. I'm still got another minute, so I'll yield that back to the whole committee.
It's too hard to divide. Mr. Larson.
Thanks. Appreciate that. One of my questions was asked by Salute Carbajal as the last one, which Mr. Cordero will get back for the record, so I don't want you to answer that. You'll get back to him for the record. I want you, though, for Mr. Cordero and Mr. Sorry, I can't read that far without my glasses. Mr. Allen, to discuss two things you alluded to. Just very briefly, the recommendation to encourage investment in technology that provides transparency and an open platform that shippers, carriers, and such can use to plan and schedule. Mr. Cordero, do you have, is there something in use like that right now? It was an issue that came up obviously during COVID. Is there a platform to be used right now that provides better transparency to all the players about where things are, when they're going to be there?
Yes, Congressman. Individual stakeholders, be it carriers, be it the terminals, truckers, the movement in terms of augmenting technology to achieve transparency and visibility is a very aggressive one. So there are platforms. I think from the Port of Long Beach perspective, I think what we're doing is putting a system together that's integrated. So no matter what platform you use, again, it will be integrated into a system and that everybody can participate. So I think, again, the answer to the question is yes. And it's, again, I think what's in the future in the next 5 years, the shape of things to come is even going to be better in terms of how fast this is moving.
Yeah, I think we heard last year during some testimony that it's not integrated, that there are a lot of platforms, but there's not a picture that folks can use. Mr. Allen, could you talk a little bit about where you think the technology ought to head?
Well, I think you've laid it out very well, Mr. Larson, and Mr. Cordero. I'll commend the Port of Long Beach for being tip of the spear on leading this efforts. I hope that we can build continuity in systems and we can integrate them. To your point, this needs to be done in a comprehensive manner across terminal operators, ports, and ocean carriers, so that we can utilize that information as efficiently as possible in one place.
That's fair enough. Appreciate that, and I will yield back 2 minutes and 43 seconds.
Mr. Easel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Leach, thank you for your testimony today before our subcommittee. Last week, the Ports of America announced a critical agreement with the Port of Gulfport. This agreement will significantly benefit my constituents and add value to one of the Gulf Coast's most underutilized gateway ports. Can you begin by talking about the importance of private-public partnerships, such as one Ports America has at the Port of Gulfport, to our nation's supply chain and critical infrastructure?
Thank you. Yes, in terms of the public-private partnerships, which is what we've endeavored to put forward and now agreed with the Port of Gulfport, provides leverage for us to play a different role. More than just a service provider doing stevedoring, we're moving into a space where we're co-investing and taking a role in the infrastructure development, as well as the marketing of that facility and the utility of that facility to a broader marketplace. So actively partnering with the port to be a steward of those assets to develop that economic and trade platform, not a port, but an economic engine.
Thank you. Despite the impressive amount of annual imports and exports that are handled at the Port of Gulfport, shallow shipping channel remains a challenge for local and regional importers and exporters. What opportunities would be realized in the Port of Gulfport if the Gulfport shipping channel was dredged to a competitive depth?
The marine access is a critical issue for many ports, not just Gulfport. But Gulfport, as you highlighted, is in an uncompetitive position relative to its port peers in the Gulf. And so the opening up of marine access in an efficient way essentially opens the entire market for Gulfport to compete with New Orleans, with Houston, with Mobile, that it doesn't have the capacity to do today.
Thank you. So you agree that dredging projects in general would lead to greater resilience in ports and marine terminals, which also would prevent further future supply chain disruptions?
Yes, it's a critical element of our overall strategy, or what should be our overall strategy from a national perspective, is marine access to ensure that all ports can compete with each other, that we have an obligation to create resiliency through greater choice of port of entry for cargo. The broader we have that base for both import and export goods, the better we are in terms of supply chain resiliency. Trying to force through the entire import base for the country through 6 or 7 ports is not a sustainable future.
Right. Thank you. Thank you again for your time today, and I thank all the folks for coming out and testifying, and we look closely to working with all of you to help create some jobs on the Mississippi coast. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thanks so much. Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act, I see Mr. Dusty Johnson here, and the pleasure of working with him to get that enacted. There's an enforcement issue in that any effort by the FMC to enforce the existing law or any future law would require them to go to court first to get permission from the court to carry out the enforcement. That's backwards. No other independent agency has that requirement. They issue a enforcement, and then the entities that are affected by that enforcement have the opportunity, if they disagree, to go to court to get it overturned. So, Mr. Leach, don't you think it's a good idea? They do it the same, that the FMC do it the same way as others, other independent agencies?
I haven't examined this in close detail to really.
Well, you will, because I'm introducing a bill to require just that. How about you, Mr. Dar, excuse me. Don't you think it's a good idea that the FMC have the same power as every other regulatory agency? That is to issue an enforcement, and then if you don't like it, go to court.
So my understanding is that the change that's proposed would actually be limited to their review of the competitive nature of agreements between carriers. And it's important that an agency have authority to carry out whatever they're tasked with. However, adjudication is a very complicated matter for an agency, and it is even more complicated to do correctly.
So you don't like the idea that the FMC have the same enforcement mechanisms as others?
I'm saying I don't know that it is the same, sir, and I leave the judgment to Congress as to how much power to vest in an agency.
Then you're neutral on it. Thank you. Let's see, Mr. Allen, do you have access? You said that you don't have access to ships. What if the queuing of ships that are waiting to get to port were to be done in such a way that those ships that would take your product and other agriculture and other export products would get to the dock ahead of those that would not? Do you think that's a good idea?
We reviewed that concept, Mr. Garamendi, and appreciate you identifying ways to provide service for exporters. We think that would be effective and should be considered with the broad suite of ideas for additional steps that may be considered going forward.
Very good. Then we'll look for your support once again, as you did with the OSHA Shipping Reform Act, as we deal with the queuing opportunity, which is a non-regulatory thing. It's just simply if your ships are going to take American cargo, you can go to the head of the line. If you don't, you can wait at the outer harbor. Let's see. Mr. Leach, And Mr. Dar, do you believe that international trade should be reciprocal? That is, if you want to import, you also have to take exports. Mr. Leach?
Well, it's not certainly part of our scope of business. We're a service provider to handle all trade. We are a facilitator, and we're indifferent. Our job is to ensure that there is capacity and capability to export.
I just want to get down to the principle here. The principle that trade is reciprocal. If importers into the United States have access to the American market, then the American exporters ought to also have access, that is, to export. Mr. Dar, do you think that's a good principle?
In principle, our business is founded on that. How
Terrific.
the balance strikes
Then you would
in the end is
support
driven by the market.
legislation that would require such reciprocal nature. That as the ocean carriers, if you want to bring exports into the United States, then you ought to be willing to take exports out of the United States so that Mr. Allen and others would have access to the space on your ships.
I think the details on how to do that would matter.
Oh, yes,
but in
always the
principle-
details. Well, there's going to be a bill to give you the opportunity to look at those details. Final point has to do with the antitrust exemption that the ocean shipping carriers have. Do you believe in free trade, capitalistic system of competition? All of you? Yes, yes, yes. I suppose all of you would think that's a good idea. Well, it just turns out that the ocean carriers are exempt from the monopoly and the antitrust laws of the United States. And there ought to be a law that the ocean carriers are subject to antitrust laws like other parts of our economy. Don't you think that's a good idea, Mr. Barr, Mr. Leach?
Sir, if you mean with regard to pricing,
I mean with
agree.
regard to
But if-
all monopolistic exercises.
I'm
I
not sure.
believe I'm out
I'm
of
not sure
time.
what that means, but the vessel sharing
That
agreement
means
says
that
it
that
exists
means
today.
that the 1980 exemption from the antitrust laws be repealed.
I don't think that's a good idea, no, sir.
I thought you might not. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Well, I think you can see my partner, John Garamendi, can be a dog with a bone when we're trying to figure out what is the best way to regulate this marketplace and ensure that, American exporters are being treated fairly and that we've got the data and the authority for the SMC to do a good job. And I want to thank John and frankly everybody who's helped us put together the Ocean Shipping Reform Act 2.0, which is being introduced today and does address a number of the issues that Mr. Garamendi talked about in his line of questioning. And I think we look forward to having another robust bipartisan success related to ocean shipping, critically important. So, Mr. Allen, I want to talk with you. You had mentioned that you weren't sure that OSRA is going to provide enough assurance to folks that they'll have the capacity, they'll have the resources needed when the marketplace otherwise wants empty exports. Help me understand that a little bit more, and in particular, did OSRA fall short someplace?
Well, the first thing I would say is that we believe when you consider the data that supports the total volume of inbound cargo, and you then compare to the spread between import and export cost, you will see a direct correlation to empty sailings. That concerns us. On its face, we feel like there should be guardrails around that. We do not know if OSRA creates those guardrails. As many people have said, the implementation and regulatory regime around OSRA is very much ongoing. And there will be complaints, and there will be rulings, and there will be rules that stand up over time. Your exchange with Chairman Maffei last week, Mr. Johnson, you suggested that this is a meal that may be consumed in courses. I think it was around a bowl of cereal. And I tend to agree with you. And when we understand the impact that comes from OSRA, we will have a better view to what needs to be done next, and I am certain there is more work to be done, and very grateful for the energy in this room to do that work.
Well, since the second bowl of Cheerios is being introduced today, Mr. Cordero, our bill does address some of the things you've talked about, which is having data standards and making sure we've got the information we need to try to harmonize some of the data sharing efforts, and you've been involved in the DOT's Flow initiative. Talk to us a little bit about where we should be headed from a data sharing and harmonization perspective?
That's a great question, Congressman. And I think the answer is that, as I mentioned before, I think it's fair to say that every sector in the industry has their respective platforms that are evolving. So where we should be heading is how do we integrate these platforms into one integrated system? And I think that's the key that I think we've received, that is the Port of Long Beach, a lot of accolades and from other ports initially, given that we just announced this just a year ago or so. So I think that's the direction, and the more funding that we have for those opportunities, the better, because I think we've gone beyond the question of proprietary interest issues. Not that it's not there, but I think everybody has the comfort that this has to move forward in a way to provide visibility and transparency in the supply chain. And this is what, in fact, the pandemic surface of many issues of the lack of visibility and transparency for the American shipper.
I think you said that very well, and we do need this information. The marketplace needs this information to really be efficient and to well serve American import and export interests. You mentioned proprietary. I mean, help us. Listen, we're going to solve the problem, but give us some guidance on how do we balance the need to protect proprietary information, as well as making sure we've got enough granularity so that people can do something with the data.
Well, I think we're there. I only say that because through technology, stakeholders have been convinced that it's not about the proprietary interest in terms of the data sharing that we're requesting. Everybody has a comfort now that all we're seeking is information to further the visibility and transparency of the cargo movement. So I think that the individual companies or sectors, whether you're a trucking company or a BCO or a terminal or a carrier, I think they now have adjusted to the fact that this is not about providing data that's not relevant to the visibility and transparency issue. So we're there, as opposed to where we were even 5 years ago, where that was a real concern.
Yeah, we've got to have this information if we're going to have the system that we deserve. Thanks, Mr. Chairman, I yield, and thanks for the subcommittee for letting me wave on. I'm grateful for your indulgence, and I yield back.
Ms. Golden, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much to our witnesses for being before the committee today and discussing such an important topic. I'm so proud to represent miles of beautiful Lake Michigan shoreline on the west coast of Michigan, including the wonderful Port of Muskegon. Ports play such an important role on the Great Lakes and are lifelines to their communities. Ranking Member Larson mentioned last week, but I want to stress again the importance of the small ports set aside under the bipartisan infrastructure law. And the Port Infrastructure Development Program that it has to ensure the movement of cargo between Canada and the U.S. on the Great Lakes. One project funded under the bipartisan infrastructure law provided Monroe, Michigan, which sits on Lake Erie, an $11 million grant for funding in 2022 and for energy resilience to build shore power and invest in the local waterfront. I'm really looking forward to other projects following suit just like this. And I'm wondering, Mr. Allen, can you please talk about the importance of investing in small ports and particularly the impact for your members and others in agriculture?
Thank you, Congressman. I would just say, as has been said already, the concept of moving cotton, in our members' case, or all commodities for U.S. agricultural stakeholders cannot be consolidated into 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 major hubs. We need a broader base. We need to utilize your port in your district. We need to utilize Mr. Ezel's port at Gulfport as he's described. We see opportunities in the near future for containerized shipping in ports that we're not using now, and that excites us. We can lower cost, we can add efficiency, we can increase the competitiveness of U.S. agriculture. If we can broaden our base, we completely support that. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, that's wonderful. We'd love to have you out and take a look at the port. My next question is for Mr. Cordero. Thank you so much. I want to give you a kudos for your Port of Long Beach, one of the most environmentally friendly in the country. My district is over 2,000 miles from the Port of Long Beach, but I can assure you that we have felt the effects of inflation and supply chain-related increases just as much. What will broad investments in ports like those in the BIL and the IRA do to increase the flow of cargo and therefore some of the inflationary conditions that have existed for the last few years?
It's a great question because for the Port of Long Beach, as I mentioned, we are, at least for 2022, the #1 containerized export port. And just recently, I had a conversation with one of your constituents there from the dairy industry, how important that market is as it comes to the San Pedro Bay complex, in my case, Port of Long Beach. So I think the answer to that question is it's an unprecedented funding for the supply chain that we are now receiving, including for the intermodal facilities. You know, we talk about inland ports. Inland intermodal facilities are just as important because, again, at the end of the day, the supply chain throughout the nation is going to be crucial to make these connectivity, whether you're a small port, whether you're an inland port, whether you're a waterway port, marine transportation highway, or a seaport like the Port of Long Beach. So I think, again, at the end of the day, the USA has a big market in the global arena with regard to exports, particularly ag and protein and dairy. So I think, yes, funding for intermodal facilities is just as important.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the rest of my time.
Mr. Arkansas.
Thank you, Chairman. So I voted against the OSRA twice in the House, precisely because of concerns about the detention and demurrage charges and what that would do to shippers and MTOs. Senate version I got on board with finally because I thought that the AAPA's recommendations for improvement were well taken and hopefully would keep the incentive principle in place. Unfortunately, we're seeing, to your excellent written testimony, both of you, that doesn't seem to be the case right now. Unfortunately, they're going in the opposite direction with broad classifications. And Mr. Leach in particular, I liked your analogy of, for my simple politician's mind, of just long-term parking on a bridge. And we don't want that. It's not a good use of the capacity. I've been heartened to hear from Mr. Allen and from you, Mr. Leach, though. It doesn't feel like we're that far apart here. It really doesn't. I hear from Mr. Allen really a good faith desire to move quickly in and out, but you want predictability, if I'm hearing you correctly, sir. And Mr. Leach, that you're willing to provide some storage, but you need also some heads up on that and then a market-based way of supplying it. So what, given that we're like, I feel you two like reaching out, trying to hold hands here. There it is, the bridge. What can the FMC do to get that, to close this and keep the incentive principle in place, which I think has served us pretty well, recognizing that you, Mr. Allen, and your co-travelers in the export industry do need some certainty? What are the final steps here? And I invite you both to participate in the colloquy.
Allow me to weigh in first, and I've engaged the FMC on this topic in the very same way, and that is partly the recognition, and I've highlighted it earlier, that an MTO has a critical role to play. But how they engage, not simply as a supplier to somebody else, as a third party, but as an active participant with direct commercial and product engagement with that cargo owner, with that shipper, with the consignee. That's the critical element here that needs to change. So it is in part about engagement and that we become an active partner in providing a service, but it's also about the information. We all agree that data sets need to be better. There needs to be better access. A cargo owner shouldn't have to go uniquely to our portal to get information.
Information is important. Incentives are also very important, and we do want to keep those incentives in place for demurrage and detention. You know, pick them up, bring them back fast. Mr. Allen?
Again, we do want to move cargo fast, and we want to take cost off the table. We want certainty, we want choice, we want an open marketplace in the manner by which we procure and utilize assets so that we can move as fast as possible and reduce cost to our customers as much as possible. At the same time, we incurred $1.3 billion worth of unbudgeted costs during this time frame, not all of which were detention or demurrage, but certainly some were, and other storage-related malfunctions and carrying costs and credit risk. In addition to the monetary cost, U.S. agriculture lost market share and faced reputational risk. And we simply must do a better job of communicating so we can operate more efficiently together.
Wouldn't you, and I can understand the frustrations that would be there when you're picking up that kind of charges for issues that are probably largely out of your control, certainly during the pandemic. Couldn't that be addressed, though, not with a broad exclusion of categories, but with just faster jurisdiction, just faster resolution of specific claims?
Maybe. Certainly, there are lots of elements to the change in this regime of who is responsible, who has the burden of proof. I think we are sending shockwaves through the industry, and I think all participants in the industry are going to be responsive, and we're going to be stronger because of that.
Okay. Well, I want to make sure the FMC hears now from a Democrat. We heard from Mr. Babin before as a Republican that we do need to get this right. The incentive principle does matter, and it doesn't need to be adversarial. I think there does seem to be a strong aligned incentives here. Finally, last 30 seconds, Mr. Dar, we've heard a previous line of questioning, pressure to take our MTO and our shipping plumbing in this country and use it as a cudgel on trade-related issues. Do you want to comment specifically on the dangers of politicizing our shipping industry on trade disputes?
I think it's fraught with quite a bit of peril and unintended consequences. And some of, whether we like it or not, some of the major shipping companies that the world relies upon are state-backed or state-owned to some degree as well. We face that competition every day. Given the right framework, we'll continue to compete and compete successfully, and we will continue to serve the commerce needs of the United States, which is my country, and I'm very proud to work for a company that believes in that every bit as much as I do.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
Mr. Van Drew, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. You know, in this Congress, one of my agendas is going to be to focus on the impact, and you've heard me speak about it before, that offshore wind industrialization has on the Atlantic maritime supply chain. Safe access to the East Coast is essential to many maritime users, including the maritime shipping industry, and all of you are represented on this panel today. Unrestrained shore wind threatens this safety. In fact, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has determined that the impacts of offshore wind on navigation and vessel traffic, and this is the Bureau of Ocean Management, would be, quote, major, and that it would increase, quote, the risk of collision, and could, quote, result in personal injury or loss of life and limb. The reasons for this are obvious. First, offshore wind leases obstruct maritime traffic lanes and force vessels into tight bottlenecks. Second, offshore wind structures interfere with navigational radar. In 2022, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine released a report concluding that offshore wind structurally can interfere with ship radar and with ship's navigation. This is a result of the electromagnetic reflections from wind, a name that you're all familiar with, the Doppler effect. And it's caused by the spinning of the blades. And let's understand, just off my East Coast, what kind of presence we're speaking about. We're speaking about thousands of windmills. We're speaking that each one of them would be 1,000 feet high. We're speaking about millions, no embellishment, millions of acres of ground used for this. Today I chose to speak about this because it's appropriate for you, but you also could talk about the environmental issues. You could speak about the issues as related to the tourism industry, as related to the fishing industry. I'd love from everybody to hear from some fishermen and what they're going through. Some of them are going to lose their businesses completely. Lose their businesses completely. Our energy is going to be controlled by foreign countries, over 50% of it, and it's going to change the entire landscape. 1,000 feet tall taller than Lady Liberty, and thousands of them. Imagine what it's going to look like. Last week, I questioned the Maritime Administrator who admitted that the government has not scrutinized this issue. I mean, she's for the issue, but still had to admit that we haven't even scrutinized it. I'm hoping that with some of the work that I'm doing and others are doing now that we will. I direct my questions to Mr. Bud Darr, Executive Director of the Mediterranean Shipping Company, or known as MSC, also here on behalf of the World Shipping Council. Mr. Darr, you have an extraordinary breadth of maritime experience, including service in the Naval Submarine Force, and thank you for that. And the U.S. Coast Guard Legal Office. Thank you for your service, and I hope you can provide some information and some clarity on these issues, Mr. Darr. Is safe access, let me put it this way, is safe access to East Coast ports important to the maritime shipping industry? Is safe access important?
Yes, sir, and thank you for your compliment. I will say it was my absolute honor to serve.
I know it is an honor, and we're honored that you did. Can physical bottlenecks impact the safety of maritime operations?
Yes, sir.
Do large maritime shipping vessels rely on radar for safe navigation?
Yes, sir, it's a very important component of navigation.
Have you heard of the Doppler effect before? Yes, sir. These things considered, do you agree with BOEM's assessment that these offshore wind projects, and this is BOEM who's even supporting this, would have a major and potentially dangerous impact on maritime shipping on the East Coast?
I can't say with precision what impact it will have, but I can say for the reasons you laid out, it must undergo close scrutiny through a proper marine spatial planning analysis to ensure those usages are deconflicted, or we may create something very unintended and very negative.
Exactly, and we have not done that. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Tola, Ms. Peltola.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am really impressed with the depth and breadth of the expertise that the panel has, and I've enjoyed learning a lot from you all today. I was going to say something like, add it up, there'd be 100 years of experience, but I don't think it's that much. I don't want to say that.
That doesn't make them feel good either, right?
Yeah, no. And my question is to Mr. Cadero, and am I pronouncing that right?
Yes.
Okay. I think a couple other members touched on it earlier, but my question is really about cold ironing, also known as shore power. And Juneau, Alaska started doing this with their cruise ships back in 2002. And I'm just wondering why more ports in America don't do this. And I'm not really sure if it's, the short time frame a vessel is at port or the technology not being available. What are some of the reasons why we don't, I think a lot of people know that when you idle your motor, it really, it's worse for the environment than when you're in gear. And so having all these vessels just in neutral at the dock to make sure they have power, it just doesn't make sense environmentally. So I was wondering if you could touch on why we haven't made more progress in this in the last 20 years.
Well, as you mentioned, I think the Port of Long Beach has made a lot of progress. We shore powered our 6 terminals in the early mid-2000s. The last one was completed in 2014. And I think the answer to your question, Congressman, one big factor is cost. I mean, it was a $200 million endeavor for us to do that. Now, what happened to assist that, at a later point, the state of California did mandate by regulation shore powering of containerized cargo terminals. So I think one is an example of what you do as an initiative as a port authority in conjunction with our regulatory agencies here, speaking on in the state of California. So I think, again, we've been able to develop that technology at the Port of Long Beach. So at this point, I think it's safe to say for any port that wants to put that in place, that technology is there. It's very simple, so to speak. In other words, you're not reinventing the wheel anymore. It's just a matter of cost.
Thank you.
Would you mind following up on that question, Mr. Dar?
I wouldn't. I apologize, Mr. Chairman, if I'm standing between you and perhaps ending this hearing. But I just wanted to offer a couple of comments because we deal with this worldwide in both our cruise and our cargo business. And first of all, shore power, unfortunately, is today mostly a theoretical conversation because it's a relatively very small number of ports where Alaska has been a leader, where it has actually been installed. So even if you make the investment on the ship side, which is modest, and we're prepared to do that where necessary, the investment on the shore side has just not been made, not been prioritized high enough. But one of the fundamental problems is you have to think about where the electricity is coming from, because particularly with greenhouse gas emissions, if I plug into a grid that's being powered from coal, I'm not sure I gained anything over the power that could have been generated on the ship. So the business case is actually very poor unless the shoreside energy production infrastructure is really there. Those are two of the major things. It's not an unwillingness on the part of the industry, and where it's provided, you generally see very high levels of uptake.
Okay, and that makes sense because in Juneau and Southeast Alaska, it really is hydropower, which is very environmentally friendly. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back for rails.
Well, that concludes our meeting, and we want to thank the witnesses for being here. Every one of you have provided some very, very good input, and we'll be back to hear more maybe at some point in time. We'll see. And I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until the time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing without objection, so that ordered. Also ask for unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for additional comments or information submitted by the members or witnesses to be included in today's record hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Committee stands adjourned.